All right, thanks for joining us for this year's Selecting Schools Workshop Part 1. This workshop is really meant to go over some of the basics to put together your school list, and it's not something you necessarily need to have done this early in the year, and it can be an ongoing process. You're going to put your first school on your application when you submit it in June. You'll hopefully have all of your schools on there kind of by mid-June, early July, but you can, if you have a lot of other things on your plate right now between thesis and MCAT and whatever else you're working on, this is a piece that can wait a little bit longer, but it also tends to be one of the fun parts in this process, is just kind of learning more about the schools and how they distinguish themselves from each other. So we try to give you the information a little bit earlier if you do find some downtime and want to do some web research and so forth. We will have a recording of this webinar and the slides will all be available on course sites. So it is going to be a lot of information. Don't feel like you need to take copious notes because you will be able to revisit this at any point. So starting off with dispelling myths, we'll go through some strategies to use and some of the basic resources that we recommend through HPA. So first big myth is that, going to U.S. News and World Report school number 1 is significantly better and will just completely change your career versus going to the quote-unquote worst U.S. medical school. This is kind of an idea that comes about, I think, partly because in college world, when you're applying to colleges, there is quite a diversity of types of colleges, experiences you can have in college. There's just a lot of them. So my Google tells me that 4,298 is the current number of accredited U.S. colleges and universities. By comparison, we have 185 MD and DO, so medical and osteopathic medical schools. And the number for dental schools and vet schools is even smaller. So the range in kind of quality across those schools is actually much smaller than it is for U.S. colleges, kind of 4-year and 2-year schools. The other thing to think about when you think best and worst is that what is best for some people is going to be worst for other people. So the same was true with undergrad, right? You kind of felt your fit for different schools. As you were at Princeton, you started to have more of a sense of what was a good fit for you in terms of what it had to offer and what was maybe less so. And so using some of that information, you're going to be able to better discern kind of what is good about a school, what could be better about a school, and use that to make some decisions. Second myth, if I apply to all of the schools, I'm bound to get into one. I don't think anyone really actually believes this. I just think that some students do kind of go in thinking if I spread my applications pretty wide, it's more likely to bring me more returns. We have found that this hasn't been the case just looking mathematically. Our students, in terms of number of acceptances, our average is the highest for students who apply to 16 to 20 schools. So I did a quick kind of calculation based on our last 4 years of applicants. For students who applied to 16 to 20, they had an average of 3.7 acceptances. 8% of those students were not accepted to any schools. 21 to 25 was a little bit more than 3 schools per applicant on average, 13% who weren't accepted. And then once you get into the high numbers, the acceptances have gone down. And this is largely because a lot of people who choose to apply to tons of schools are the ones who are more worried about their academic metrics or more worried about their candidacy overall, and therefore decide to try to cast a wider net. We've actually found that kind of the return on investment when you cast a wide net can get lower because you have less time to really devote to each school and apply to it in the most thoughtful way. I also double check to see kind of, is there a certain magic number of applications that students are sending out in order to get accepted? So in terms of students who are not accepted to any med school over the past 4 years, the average number of applications they put in was 23. For our students who were accepted to medical school, average number was also 23. So clearly it's not just about kind of a magic golden number as far as how many you should apply to in order to get in. It's more about choosing schools that are the right fit for you and kind of within your range in terms of what you're looking for, what your metrics look for, etc. And I just like to kind of think about number of applications in terms of a diminishing returns curve. I think that putting a lot of time in at the beginning, choosing your top 16 to 25, depending on which schools you're going to apply to, really putting a lot of energy into writing strong secondaries, staying on top of your communication with those schools, really catering your application to kind of what they're looking for is going to be more successful than kind of trying to cast a really wide net, maybe not understanding the mission and the philosophy of the school as much, not catering your secondary and your communication to your schools as well, because you just have so many schools that you're trying to juggle. And for different students, obviously, this is going to be a different curve, and there's some things that you can do on the outset of this process to prepare yourself better to apply to more schools, as far as pre-writing secondary, starting your research a little bit earlier, maybe adding some schools a little bit later. But I think generally speaking, kind of the 16 to 25 schools tends to be a good number to learn a lot about them, get strong secondaries in, etc. And this also I think comes partly from undergrad, the idea that a state school is a safety school. You've probably heard me say before that there is no safety school in this process. There are certainly some states where just by virtue of how many seats there are for in-state applicants within the state, you might have a better chance of getting into your state school. So a West Virginia applicant, knowing how many seats there are in med school versus how many students are trying to get into those seats, they just, statistically speaking, have a higher chance of getting accepted versus a California applicant where, as you can see, over 6,000 California residents applied, only 1,000 of them are going to school in state. This is specifically for MD schools. So if we expand it out a little bit and look at Western and Toro, and I think there's one more DO school in California these days, the number gets a little bit higher, but it's still just a matter of there's a high saturation of pre-meds who are from California versus certain other states. And if you want to look at the data for your state, you can find it all on the AAMC website on this link that's on this slide. They break down the stats by a bunch of different demographics that might help you get a better sense of where you stand in the national pool on a couple of different, I think they look at state and gender and age and things like that. So now that we've talked a little bit about myths, a few of the realities of this process, it's not necessarily like college where you all knew that you were going to get into a college. If you got into Princeton, you had to be pretty sure you were going to get into college. Medical school is just a different ballgame in terms of what they're looking for, in terms of the level of competition for the seats. And then there are aspects of it that you really can't control. So you can't help the fact that you're from California unless you want to take another 2 years out of school to establish residency in another state. You can't do much about some of the pieces that you've already established within your application. You can't do anything about the fact that so many people currently want to go to medical school. So those are a few of the things that it's just, you kind of leave it to fate. This is where you are right now. We've seen the acceptance rate go down a little bit from past years. It's actually a little bit better than it was last year. So we'll see. Maybe in your year, it'll be a little bit more in favor of applicants in terms of how many people are applying versus accepted. And then the reality also, none of our applicants in the past 4 years, 6 years, since I've worked at Princeton, no one has been accepted everywhere that they've applied. So you just have to get used to the idea that you're going to apply to a lot of places. Some of them you might hear from right away. Some of them you might never hear from and have a silent rejection and not know what's going on for, a whole year of your life from certain schools. So it's just part of the process. And again, you have to kind of go in knowing that you're confident about your candidacy. You've done the things you needed to do on the front end and that things are going to work out for you through the process. So on average, our students apply to about 23 schools, on average around 7 interviews, but it can be from 0 to 20-ish. Very few get 20. 0 to 12 is probably a more realistic, minus the outliers. And then on average, we have about 3 acceptances per applicant. But again, it can range from 0 to 15-ish. So it's also impossible to set yourself up as the perfect candidate for every medical school because every medical school is looking for something a little bit different. There are a ton of different dimensions that they might be evaluating you on, thinking about how much value they place on these things. The biggest, most obvious one is schools that are very research-oriented versus schools that are very primary care or patient care-oriented. If you're setting yourself up as an ideal research candidate, there are going to be some schools that just don't make any sense, or you won't make any sense to them as an applicant based on their mission and what they're looking for. But there are other factors too that they might be looking at that you might not even know are selection factors in their minds, because you can't be kind of thinking about every medical school and everything they might be looking for and kind of create an application that is going to be good for all of them. That's not the point of this. The point of this is to make yourself a really strong medical school applicant in terms of your vision for your future, your values, and then find the schools that kind of speak that same language. And that is what this process of school selection is really about. So the realities can be a little bit scary when you think about them, but at the same time, the silver lining behind it all is that there is quite a lot you can control. Our applicants from Princeton have a much higher success rate because you all do amazing things. We set you up really well for success in this process. You're just, you've done application processes well in the past. You kind of know how to bring yourself through and give yourself the room to succeed in this kind of process. You have a lot of control over a lot of factors in your candidacy, and even things that you're feeling like might not be as strong as you want them to be. If you give yourself another year, sometimes that can give you a lot more control. So that's something that we can be talking about until you submit your application, is like, as you're looking at schools, are you competitive to the level that you want to be now, or is it going to take more time so that you can kind of keep developing that candidacy? Any school you go to in the U.S. is going to be quality training, accredited, vetted. Students get in, get out, get their degrees and practice. So you can know that any school you go to is going to prepare you to do what you want to do. And a lot of kind of your experience in med school isn't about the school you're at, it's kind of what you put into it. So your input is really going to affect your output no matter where you are. You can create a positive experience for yourself. So basic task as far as school selection and this piece of the process is to choose schools where you can get your foot in the door, and we give you as many tools as we can to help you figure that out. Once you've kind of gotten those aim schools that you want to look for, really be able to help them see how the things that you do match the things that they're looking for. So based on your concrete experiences, the skills you've gained in your time at Princeton, the values that you hold, why does that make sense for each given school on your list? And then convey this fit through the way that you talk about your experiences in your activities list on your application, in your personal statement, especially in your secondaries, and even more so in the way that you comport yourself at your interview. So that's the basic goal. Foot in the door first, and then convince people beyond that, and then, make sure it's the right fit for you as well. It's not just you convincing them, but it's helping kind of think critically about whether the school really is what you saw on paper as you get to know it better through interviews and continued research. So right now, as you start school research, every school is going to seem the same. Every mission statement is going to feel very similar. Every school is going to look like they're really stressing the same things to you. But the more that you look into schools, the more you'll start to be able to discern things that are different from school to school. The more notes that you take, even if you feel like every school's notes look the same, that's going to be information that is going to help you when you go back and you are writing secondaries and you're thinking about the things you want to ask schools at interviews. So kind of taking more notes than fewer at the beginning is probably the way that I would recommend going. And the more schools that you start to do this about, kind of taking your handwritten notes or taking your screenshots or whatever makes sense, the more you'll be able to start to see things that you should really be honing in on as an applicant. So by the time you apply, it will be that you've been able to start to see the differences between schools. And it might even be 3 schools are all very strong in research, but it's the way that they talk about why research is important to them, what you can get out of being a research student there. So it's kind of going a little deeper than just this school really values research, to kind of think about how they make sense of that and what they offer you as a student. And then, again, most of the rest of it is fit. What will they give you? What will enhance your future as a physician? What will you give them? How will you enhance their learning community? The basic roadmaps. So whichever professions you're applying to, this is a worthy investment to make of your time and money, is getting a copy of this guide. The DO one is free online. The rest of them are $20 to $35. MSAR is all online. The ADIA guide is still on paper, and the VetMed admission requirement book is also still on paper. The DO one is available online, or you can buy it. I think it's $15 to buy it, but it's free as a PDF online. So that's going to be kind of the official guide to everything you need to know about each school. Each school is presented with kind of the same basic framework so that you'll be able to look at schools in a more comparative way than via websites. The other roadmap that you should use if you're applying to medical school is the HPA spreadsheet. So if you go into course sites, you will see something, I think it's the second link there, called the HPA School Selection and Application Tracker, or something along those lines. So it hasn't been updated for this year's MSAR because this year's MSAR hasn't been released yet, so we're still on last year's, but they should release it in the next month or so, and then we'll update the spreadsheet with more recent data. But basically what we do is pull information from MSAR, the Med School Admission Requirements book, the College Information book, the DO book, a little bit from US News, and then a bunch from our Princeton data. And we put it all in one big spreadsheet so that you can see all of the schools in one place with a lot of the quantitative information about those schools. So if it were me as an applicant, I'd probably go through the spreadsheet, kind of sort it by each column where the numbers are meaningful. So for me, that's kind of MCAT, Science GPA, Cumulative GPA, and then kind of highlight in green the places where you feel like you're within that range. So if my MCAT was a 514 and my Science GPA was a 355, maybe I would highlight in green everything that was kind of 513 to 515, 3.55 to 3.65, and kind of then you can visually see as you're looking through the spreadsheet, okay, this is a school where my numbers kind of fit within the target range. You could also go through and for schools where their 10th% Science GPA or their 10th% MCAT, I think MCAT is on there. I don't think we have it on here, but we could. The 10th percentile MCAT is higher than where your scores fall. That's probably a school that might not as much be in your range because you know only 10% of the students who are accepted at that school had a GPA or an MCAT where your numbers are. So that can help you kind of see where you're kind of below what they tend to be looking for applicants or even above where they tend to look for applicants. So if your GPA is super high and their 90th percentile is considerably lower than where your GPA is, that's a school that might think you're not going to go there because you're going to go to a school with higher numbers. So it can work both if your numbers are on the lower side and if your numbers are on the higher side. You're kind of looking for schools where you're right within their sweet spot as much as you can. So this spreadsheet is also color-coded, so the names of the schools, the far left column, if it is red, it means that that school accepts very few applicants from out of state. If the school is green, it means that they accept quite a few students from out of state. So state residency is a big piece of this, and we tried to give you that visual so that you would know which schools might not make sense for you based on where you're from. So those are the two big pieces, the school guides that the professional associations publish and the HPA spreadsheet that we publish are kind of your two, I feel like, primary/initial sources of information. So as far as things to think about, I tend to look at two different kinds of consideration. One is things where something about your candidacy might just disqualify you for a school. So that could be prereqs, it could be residency, it could be numbers. And then variable considerations are more like, these are things where some of these will be important to some of you, maybe less so to others. There might be things that make a school absolutely inviable for you, whereas it might be a really good school for someone else. So that's how I think of variable. And I'll just go through each of them in some detail and give you some more information. There's the slides that are hidden from the screen views that you'll be able to access on course sites tend to have some more lists of schools that kind of fit in each of these categories, and I'll mention that as we get through them. So state residency is the first thing. It's a big deal for public schools. There are certain public schools in some states that have agreements with the state that they will only accept residents of that state. So make sure that you know kind of whether that is true of certain schools. If you are from any of the states that are in parentheses here, it is worthwhile to look into this interstate agreements because you might qualify for schools. This is especially useful for students in states where there isn't a state school at all. So some states have made agreements with other states for their residents to go to those med schools if that state doesn't have a school. The same is true of veterinary schools. So states that don't have vet schools will often have contracted a certain number of seats with a vet school in another state so that their residents have kind of the same in-state consideration as far as schools really looking at those students in a different way than they would look at an out-of-state resident. So look into those if they apply to you. When you apply on your AMCAS application, on your primary application, you can only declare one state of residency. So if you're not sure which state, you might declare based on maybe one parent lives in one state and one lives in another, or you've been independent from your parents for a long time and are trying to figure out if where you live now versus where they live makes the most sense. It helps to do some Googling just of how does this state define residency? And I really do just do like New York State residency for educational purposes, I think is what I usually use as my search term. And hopefully you will come across some state school or some registrar's office where it goes into some useful amount of detail about what it means to be a resident of that state. Usually a combination of driver's license, car registration, voter registration, permanent address, taxes. But state by state, it can be different. So it's worthwhile to just look into it and make sure that the state that you are declaring yourself a resident of really makes sense more so than other states. And then as you're looking at the schools through the MSAR or through whatever publication, they will always list how many students from out of state they have recently interviewed, accepted, and matriculated. And then if you are not from a state but you have ties to an area, it's not something that you can necessarily put in your primary application, but it is certainly something that you might talk about in your secondary or in continued conversations with the school to show that you have ties to an area. This is just to give you an idea of the data that you have access to for MD schools. Similar charts are available for other professions. I don't remember what school this is, but it's kind of showing you that for this school, about half of their in-state applicants were interviewed. So 523 applicants, 256 were interviewed, whereas over 2,000 students from out of state applied to that school and only 76 were interviewed. So that might be a place where, unless I had strong ties to that state or to its mission, it might not make as much sense for me to apply if I was an out-of-state resident. Would almost certainly not make sense for me to apply if I was an international student. As you can see, none of them were interviewed. If you are an international student, we have some additional information within our office to give you about kind of schools where our international students have had success recently as well. But you can see this chart through MSAR or through other publications for every school out there, and it might help you get a sense of whether that school makes sense strictly from a state residency point of view. And if you have questions as we go, you can type them into the chat box. I will try to keep watching the chat box in case anything comes up. All right, second quantifiable piece is whether or not you meet a school's prerequisites. And it doesn't hurt to just make sure that you've gone back through, if you're using a lot of AP credit, and making sure that the wording on their website makes sense for how you've decided to address taking prerequisite courses. If you are not sure whether you meet prerequisites, you can check with us first, and we can kind of give you an idea based on our work with that school, what's worked recently. You can also get in touch directly with admissions offices. On the right-hand side of the screen, you can kind of see a quick email that you might send out. I do recommend doing this by email rather than by phone, just because then you have in writing what the school's decision was about whatever you're asking in terms of whether you meet a prereq or not. I think it helps to have that in writing. Most schools require a C or better, so if there are prerequisites that you have C minuses in, make sure that you are either planning to retake them or only applying to schools where they will accept the C minus. Most schools are happy to have you have one or two outstanding prerequisites as you go into the application year, but there are some schools that will place more kind of stringent demands on that in terms of what they're saying on their website. So they might say, we expect all applicants to have finished prerequisites before applying, or they might say, to be a competitive applicant, you should have all of your courses done. There are a lot of different ways schools might phrase it in terms of how strict they seem to be about how many prereqs you have left to take. The third piece that I like to think about is selection factors. This is another place where, as you look at schools at the very beginning, it's going to look like all their graphs look exactly the same. And there actually isn't a super huge amount of kind of difference, divergence from school to school. I think largely because a lot of pre-health students just do all the same things. So even if a school doesn't super value research, it turns out that so many students do research that they end up with a lot of students who did research in their entering class. So this is Jefferson Med's little chart that shows what percent of their applicants, accepted applicants over the past 2 cycles, I guess it's matriculants, what percent of their matriculants did each of these things before they applied. So did they show community service and volunteering on their AMCAS application? Had they shown that they had volunteered in a medical or clinical community service or volunteer setting, etc. So with each school, you'll be able to see this chart and kind of see how students compare to your own application, how schools compare to each other, how it might change from year to year. And then within a school website, you're going to potentially, depending on the school and their philosophy, get a little bit more detail about what they're looking for in their applicants. So again, this is Jefferson, and it's one where you can see, they say out of classroom experiences, which could be many different things, and research could fall within that, but it isn't a school that tends to value research super highly. They tend to value community service much more highly than they do research experience. So if you're a student whose whole narrative in their application is about research, and you've done very little service work outside of the bubble, it might not be the best school for you in terms of just the application that you're able to convey to them. Even if service has been very important to you, just kind of at your core and your mission as a human, if you haven't demonstrated it through your activities and through how you've spent your time, it's much harder to make that argument. All right, the other couple of pieces about selectivity, MCAT and GPAs is the obvious one that everybody thinks about. So are your numbers within the range for that school? And it's these 10th to 90th percentile infographics only came onto the scene a couple of years ago, and I really like them because it gives you a much wider kind of understanding of what schools are looking for. And also you can look at Princeton averages because sometimes they do diverge somewhat from the national numbers. The place people don't think to look as much at selectivity is how many students were interviewed versus accepted. So there are some schools out there that have reasonably, relatively low MCAT GPA averages, but they might have 14,000 applicants for 200 seats. Well, so to me, that's as selective as a school that has considerably fewer applicants, or differently selective, I suppose. A school that has fewer applicants but higher metrics. It just means that they're looking at metrics as less of a value maybe, but at certain other things about your fit for their school and their mission are going to be really important to them. So they have kind of a profile of a student in mind and who's going to stand out from those 14,000 when they're looking to see who they're going to interview. And it's fine if you don't fit exactly within a range, or if you've applied to a bunch of schools that have tons of applicants to the numbers who are interviewed and accepted, if you really feel like that school makes sense for you based on parts of your profile as an applicant. So where that can come into play, if you've done a summer internship at a school, if you have a strong relationship with kind of people within the school through your own network, if its mission just fits perfectly with what you're looking for, if you've developed a relationship with the admission office through going to virtual fairs or getting kind of in contact with those schools by email or whatever ways that they've kind of reached out to you, those are all reasons that you might have a more personal connection. Similarly, if you're working in a medical school or an affiliated hospital for a medical school during your glide years, sometimes that can really make a difference because they've already seen how you're a good fit for their community, their culture, just from your experience there. So that can also make a difference. So compelling reasons, you don't want every school on your list to be well above your metrics and you have to have come up with whatever these compelling reasons are. You want a fair number of your schools to kind of be realistic for your metrics and your selection factors. But it's fine to have a few schools on your list. It's fine to have a couple schools where you're like, I don't really have a compelling reason. I just can't imagine not applying to this school. Like, it's fine to have a couple of those as long as your whole list is not those kinds of schools. So this is the infographics I was mentioning. For every MD school, you'll be able to see this. So for this school, 80% of their applicants were between a 506 and a 520 MCAT, a 3.49 and a 3.96 overall GPA, 3.4 to 3.97 science GPA. So it just gives you kind of a quick at a glance, where do I stand versus recent applicants to this school. These charts are available for, I think the pull down has accepted applicants for in-state matriculants as well as out-of-state. So you can also kind of see if it's UMass Med and you're not a Massachusetts resident, you can look and see kind of compared to out-of-state applicants to UMass Med, how did you square up? Versus if you're a New Jersey resident, you can look at kind of the New Jersey resident averages. So they've actually added a couple of more dimensions to this that used to be available, which is nice. All right. So beyond numbers and state residency and prerequisites, location tends to be the most important factor that students look at. It makes sense. You're spending 4 years of your young life there, and you want to be somewhere where you feel like you can thrive as a human as well as a student, because that's a pretty good chunk of your time to be spending there. So some of the factors that people look at, do you drive is actually kind of important. There are some schools where you just have to have a car in order to be a student. So if you know you do not drive, do not want to drive, do not plan to drive, it might limit your list of schools. Personal support system, and again, some of these things are much more important to some people than others. So it's thinking about, what do you want for yourself? It's okay if those things are different from someone else. Another piece that goes into location is there are some medical schools that are very standalone, or professional schools that are standalone, don't have an undergrad campus, are very focused on graduate medical or health education, versus schools that are integrated directly within their undergrad school. So University of Chicago, you'll walk by undergrads as you're walking to your med school classes. It's very integrated. So for some students, they want that very specific focus on the graduate. For some students, they'd really prefer to be somewhere where they have all of the opportunities that become more available with the broader student body. And for some people, they're like, it doesn't really matter to me, which is also fine. And then if you're interested in dual degrees, it doesn't hurt to kind of get a sense of what's available to you at that school. I like lists, so you get one list. These are just cities that some people don't think of as, the big cities that everyone thinks about, but that have been seen to be good places to live as a young person right now. If you like time-killing, procrastinatory personality quizzes, I found a random list of spend 5 minutes answering these questions and it'll tell you where you should live. So I think those are fun. I also think that looking at pretty pictures of med school campuses is fun. So those are a few of the links that I gave you. Mission Fit is one of those. Again, they're all going to sound the same as you start looking at them. If you've already done your pre-application materials, you'll see that we gave you 4 mission statements. And hopefully you could tell, reading those and thinking critically about them, that they were pretty different from each other. The other interesting thing, as we ask you to kind of talk about why whatever mission statement is your favorite, everyone says something a little bit different as far as why they picked out the mission statement they did and why it resonates with them. So that's really what you want to be doing, is reading mission statements and thinking about why they're meaningful for you specifically. These are some of the values or characteristics or qualities about medical schools that might come out within their missions. Often some are stressed or focused on more than others. The way that they're emphasized can be different from school to school. Few examples that I think are pretty distinct from each other. So Loma Linda for sure is probably the most distinct in that it's a very faith-based medical school. It's within the Seventh-day Adventist religion. Not everyone who goes there is a Seventh-day Adventist, but that's the philosophy, that's kind of the ethos of the school. Mayo is very focused on leadership. Quinnipiac or Nutter in Connecticut is very focused on being interprofessional and focused on primary care. So those are some of the things you'll start to see as you look at missions. There's a video on the AAMC website about Mission Fit. It's 3 admissions people talking about what Mission Fit means is in terms of finding the fit for you. And I think it's a useful webinar and I liked watching it. So that link is there for you as well. Curriculum. I talk a lot about curriculum and then I'm going to tell you it doesn't really matter because wherever you go, they're training you to take the same tests and to do some of the same things. But it is one of the places where you can kind of talk about in your application why a school resonates with you, why it's a good fit for you in terms of the kind of learner you are. So just basics. Med school tends to be divided between undergrad medical education, which is med school, and graduate medical education, which is residency. You're going to focus mostly on the undergraduate medical education part, and then it tends to be split between preclinical training and clinical training with some scary exams stuck in the middle. So preclinically, you'll most likely see a curriculum that's 18 to 24 months. 18 tends to be the newer model. It could be as short as 12 months. Duke does everything that's kind of classroom-based in 12 months. The teaching style can vary from small group learning to problem-based learning to lots of lectures to flipped classrooms. So just getting a sense of why do they teach the way that they do, why would that be good for me as a learner can be helpful. And then some of the classes you'll just kind of have to take, but how much room is there for you to make your curriculum your own if that's important to you? Is there a chance to do something that's kind of an independent project like a thesis at Princeton was? Are there ways to do concentrations in certain areas that will help you differentiate yourself from others and help you delve more deeply into an area of interest? Scholarly concentrations run from med education to medical humanities to service to design thinking. There's a lot of stuff out there, and kind of seeing which ones might be helpful to you in your vision of your future could be a useful way to kind of differentiate schools from each other. And then how much patient care training is there in your preclinical years? How is it done? Why is that important to you? For some schools, you do a lot of work with standardized patients at first, so you really get a chance to practice on people who are trained to train you how to work with them. In other schools, you're given your first real patients with a faculty preceptor who makes sure that you don't do anything egregious with them. But you might get your real patients from your first year of med, or your first weeks of med school. So if there's a model that makes more sense to you, or there's something about your training that you think really speaks to one or the other, that might be something that you can highlight in your application. As you're looking at curriculum, you'll see a lot of these pretty graphics of curriculum maps. It might be a way, again, to kind of look at the different ways that medical schools have set themselves up, what the rationale was for that, what kind of learners might be better in certain curricula versus others, and how you can talk about why you're the kind of learner who would really benefit from the Duke curriculum where you have a 1-year scholarly experience, for example. So that's the big graphic here. Or if you'd be better suited to a school where you have the full 2 years to really focus on the preclinical curriculum and you want kind of that time to really learn the behind the scenes book stuff before you do more with patients. But again, you don't want to get too bogged down. All of the schools are going to be preparing you well for your boards and for your residencies and for your rotations. Another piece that I should mention that everyone thinks is very important is the evaluation system. So certainly if you have grades, you deal with grades, it's fine, you get through it. Most med school students will tell you that they much prefer the pass-fail curriculum. It tends to make things feel more collaborative. It tends to take some pressure off, at least for the first couple of years. So looking into that, if that's something that's important to you, it's usually on the website somewhere, but sometimes it's harder to find, and that's a good place to just kind of talk to some students. How are you evaluated? Why does that work for you? And then also academic support. Is there tutoring? Is there learning consultations? What is there for students if they are struggling, which hopefully you won't be, but if you want to know that that's there for you, it doesn't hurt to look into that. And then career guidance, especially if you're very undecided about what you might want to do in medicine, kind of knowing what structures are set up to help you explore that can also be a useful thing that people look for. As far as dual degrees, most students will not apply for their dual degree at the time of the application to medical school unless you're MD, PhD. Usually students will wait until at least into their first year to just see what's out there, see what might be the best fit for them, because there are so many different kinds of masters you can do alongside your med degree. But just if you know that you have an interest in business or in public health or in some other area, you can be, as you're looking at your med schools, looking at what might be available at that school to do a joint degree, or even looking at how many students from a given school decide to take time to do a joint degree, so that you can see, is this going to be a norm at your school, or are you going to feel like an outlier? Specific to MD, PhD, there's a big chart, which is also available on course sites, that gives you a sense if you're not going to do a traditional kind of basic science discipline, if you're looking at anthro or public health or something like that, you'll be able to see whether that's offered at a school. You'll also potentially want to look into whether there are researchers at a given school that you'd want to work with, because you're only going to be able to work with who's there. So if you know the kind of research you want to do, doing some delving into a website to see who's doing that kind of work, who you might want to work with. Usually when you go to interviews, you'll be asked to kind of identify a few people you might want, a few researchers you might want to research with, or might want to interview with. So if you do some of that legwork earlier on, you'll have a better sense of whether that's a good fit school for you. As far as the clinical curriculum, lots of different things to look at. I think a lot of medical students really emphasize that undergrad, or that applicants should be thinking about what kind of clinical training they're going to get, because that's going to be much more kind of what is valuable and important when you're applying for residency, is what you're able to see on the wards in your clerkships. So what kind of hospitals might you get to be in? If you want to do global health, are there ways to do that? Is it purely by lottery? So they might have 6 really great hospitals, but you don't necessarily know where you're going to be placed, or do you have some say into that? Kind of, if you're really interested in emergency med or trauma med, maybe you want somewhere that has a level 1 trauma center. If you're really interested in working with the underserved, making sure that there are clinics, federally qualified health centers, other places where you'll get to work with those populations. And then wherever you're in medical school, you're likely to start making some relationships, developing your network. So if you know for sure that you want to be in a certain place as a practitioner, it doesn't hurt to look kind of pretty strongly at schools in that area, since you can start putting down roots and working on that network there. Student body, probably more important at a medical school than it was at Princeton, just because there are fewer people to choose from. So at Princeton, you're pretty sure you're going to find some people who are your people. At med school, you might have 85, you might have 270, but most med schools don't get much bigger than that. So you want to make sure it's kind of a place where you feel like you could find your people, where you're going to vibe with just the general environment. A lot of students will look into certain student orgs or student activities that they did as undergrads that they'd like to continue at their medical school and beyond. So just thinking about whether it's a place that you would want to spend time and the people you would want to spend time with for the next 4 years. And it's not something that's easy to glean until you interview. You can think about, if you had a great Princeton experience and there are a bunch of Princeton people who are at a school and happy there, that might be a good sign to you that you might be happy there. It can be a nice place if you do know people who are in the medical world, whether current students or older people who know you well, that just say, in your school research or in what you know of med schools, are there places that you can see me just based on my personality and why? So that's a good place to use kind of your human resources where you can. Then other factors, and this isn't all of them, this is just some that have come up with students who we've talked with. We actually have a book called Get Into Medical School that has a list of, I think, 95 or so different just factors that you could consider as a future medical student. So if you want to see a much longer laundry list of things, just to get an idea of what other people think you might care about, we have that in our office. Cost, and I know it sounds easy to say but hard to believe. It's probably the last thing that I would be basing a school list on. Med school is going to be expensive, most likely either way. If you're really limiting yourself just by cost of attendance or by average debt, there might be a school that was a perfect fit for you, that seeing you as a perfect fit, they were able to find some more financial aid than a different school that's on your list. So I would really encourage you to do just some preliminary research. Don't completely discount the fact that different schools are different prices, but don't use it as your first cut when you're looking at schools. As you look at cost, use cost of attendance versus tuition. Cost of attendance takes into account all the pieces, so tuition, books, living, everything that you'd be able to get financial aid on. So tuition number isn't always as indicative as cost of attendance number. You'll also be able to you'll know what the average debt is at every school because it's listed in the publications. And then types of assistance, you're more likely to see more information on a website than you are in MSAR, but they do have some basic information. And then this is the little chart that you will see. And again, I think a lot of students think fancy private school is likely to be more expensive in the long run than your state schools, but it really depends on the school and their philosophy and how much endowment they have and a lot of other factors. And an average doesn't also necessarily mean that you'll be at the average. It could be that you have considerably less or considerably more debt. So you don't necessarily want to take the average as the number, but it can help you do some comparison from school to school. Yeah. So this is SUNY Brooklyn, which is it's a state school, and their out-of-state rates are much higher. Whereas WashU is a private school, their tuition is high, but their average indebtedness is low because of some of the aid opportunities that they have. DO schools, I'm not going to necessarily try to I really like DO schools, so I try to convince everyone, honestly, to consider DO schools. But certainly, if you're like, I can never imagine having letters after my name that are not MD, I will apply multiple times rather than apply to DO schools. That is absolutely your choice, but I do encourage you to do some research into what DO means, why it's, considered the same, basically training and preparation to be a doctor as an MD program is. It broadens your school list, especially if you want to be in a very certain part of the country or if there's something else that really is valuable to you in terms of your application. There's a lot of students in DO schools, so it used to be a much smaller proportion of students. The more students who become DOs, the more it's going to be well known within kind of society. I feel like there's still a bit of a stigma around DO, especially in certain parts of the country where they're not as popular. But in reality, and if you ask a lot of doctors, they'll be able to tell you they have really strong DO students who are doing better than some of their MD students in residencies as faculty, as researchers, etc. So don't discount it just along the fact that, the letters are different. Do your due diligence. If it still doesn't feel like the right fit for you, that's fine. But don't just dismiss it out of hand. Newer medical schools is something else to think about. It's been a big trend recently to just start new medical schools. It's partly because we don't have enough physicians and people, the world, society, and the US is trying to address that. So, new schools, there are pros and cons. You have a lot less of kind of the established alumni network, the tried and true things that have worked for a school. But on the other hand, it means that they're maybe more open to innovation, maybe more open to student feedback on changing and improving things kind of on the fly. Some of them, especially if you are entering in their first couple of classes, might have some pretty nice financial incentives to have you participate. So certainly, I would say don't discount a newer school out of hand, but also do be very critical. Just because it's free doesn't mean it is right for you, kind of thing. Hackensack is the newest medical school in New Jersey. It opened last year. We have 2 students there. There's a new school opening in California for this application cycle, and they will be coming to campus in April. So it will be a new school that you can kind of talk to someone who was part of the founding group and kind of see what they've done with that school. Within the slides that you can see online, I have a list, kind of a laundry list of just the schools that have opened in the last 8 years, both MD and DO, so that you'll know which ones they are. All right. Any questions so far? Just talk in this webinar. No, you're all good? All right. So those are some selection factors to think about. Now I'm going to go through some of the resources that you might want to start using. Basics to begin with. AAMC Facts for medical school applicants is all of your national data. Lots of useful charts that have GPAs and MCATs and number of applicants, and you can kind of see where you fall compared to the national pool for the past. I think they have some charts that go back 10 years and some that are just from the most recent application cycles. The one that I like the most is the MCAT GPA grid, because you can see nationally how many students at your GPA and your MCAT applied to med school and were accepted. which can just give you a nice sense, kind of in the grand scheme of applications, where you stand. MSAR I already mentioned. If you don't have it yet, we do have a copy. It's an online resource, so we have a password that you're allowed to use in our office if you want to test drive it first and see kind of what all information is available in it before deciding to purchase it. If you're eligible for the fee assistance program, you get free access to the MSAR. But it's the best place to kind of have a lot of at-a-glance information for MD programs in the US and Canada. I already showed you all these charts. This is just kind of, I didn't mention that they do for, in any school's record that you go into an MSAR, you can also see kind of the national data. So this chart will show up for every school. As you're looking at these charts, it also helps to kind of look at how wide, I call them capsules. So how wide the capsule is probably indicative of how holistic or how much they're looking beyond just grades at certain things about your candidacy. So Case Western has a pretty wide range when it comes to MCAT. When it comes to GPA, maybe it's slightly less wide when it comes to MCAT. So maybe they are looking kind of more for certain numbers for MCAT than they might be for GPA. Hopkins is very focused, as you can tell by their little chart on GPA, compared to Case. So I feel like the smaller capsules you see, the more those numbers and being within those ranges is probably important for a given school. On course sites, we have a bunch of different stuff to look through. I think the fun one is the Princeton School Choice Opinions. So every year at the end of the cycle, we ask students to just write 1 to 3 reasons why the school they chose is the school they're going, or the school they're going to, why they chose the school they're going to. And so you just get like a really quick snapshot of, I chose Hopkins because X. And it's from your peers from the last few years, and it might just give you information that you'll also start to glean as you look at websites, but it might, something about what they wrote might resonate, might give you an idea about a school you hadn't thought of before. And we also have, if you're a Woody Woo or a humanities major, just a sense of what students within your discipline, what schools they might have ended up at in recent years. And then just a whole bunch of other stuff. And some of these will be more interesting to some of you than others, but we just wanted to give you as much as we could to get started in terms of resources. This piece is only in our office, so if you're an alum and want to know your data, we are happy to screenshot it and send it to you. It is, sensitive enough data that we don't necessarily want to put it on our website in case it does end up more widely circulated. So this is basically for the most recent 4 application cycles. We've broken down what schools our applicants were accepted to at each kind of 1/10 of science GPA range. So for students who had a 3.3 to 3.39 science GPA and had not taken post-bac courses and had a 66th percentile to 79th percentile MCAT range, they were accepted to Cooper, East Tennessee, Jefferson, Rebel, Johnson, Temple, and Tennessee. So it's very granular. It also shows you whether they were direct entry applicants or whether they took time off. So we're able to show you, like, okay, if your GPA was this and your MCAT was this, past students from Princeton, here are the schools where they were accepted. So we're happy to send you kind of your list of schools, and that might be, it doesn't mean, obviously, that you will get into all of the schools, but it might give you some school names that you hadn't considered before that happen to have really worked for students in your exact range in recent years. School websites is another place where you'll do probably most of your research once you've done kind of the preliminary MSAR work. So this can get a little overwhelming. We recommend you start with a couple of schools that you're pretty likely to apply to. Likely your public state school will be one of them. Start with the MSAR entry, then go into a school website. Start with for applicants section, which most schools have. I think view books are nice because they tend to have pretty pictures and kind of just a smaller amount of information. The curricular pages can also be helpful. And then there are certainly plenty of other places that you can go to find background information. Some schools have really great social media presences. Wikipedia is always going to have some basic info for you. But those are probably the main places online that you'll find useful info. A little bit about UNIS News rankings, because it is a thing that exists that has some value, but not necessarily as much value as some people tend to place on it. You all are smart. You know how to read data. I highly recommend that you go into the methodology behind U.S. News just so you understand where these numbers are coming from, remembering the fact that there are a number of schools that just consciously choose not to participate in the rankings at all. So don't just use the list of schools that are ranked when you're looking at your schools, because you're going to miss out on some schools that are really great schools. And then obviously you can't just use U.S. News rankings as your go-to, and not do any research beyond that to be able to know your fit, because then your secondaries are all going to feel very generic and you're not going to be able to convince the schools that you belong there. You can't go to interview and they ask you, why do you want to come here? And you just say, well, you're the number 1 ranked school on the U.S. News. That doesn't really mean anything. So it's certainly fine to look at it, to understand it, to use it to get a little bit of basic information, but don't use it as the only source of your school search. Just so that you, very basics of how the methodology works. This is the problematic point for me. One piece is that I don't know that MCAT, GPA, and acceptance rate should necessarily be part of the rankings. I don't know. I think those are just numbers that, why does it really matter? If it's the right fit student, what does it matter that this school had a really high average MCAT? The peer assessment and residency director assessment scores, also, it's just, they send a survey to a bunch of humans and say, rank these schools from 1 to 5, unless you don't know enough about them, in which case say, not applicable. And maybe you think that's great data. It makes me a little nervous. I think a lot of people's assessment scores are based on what they knew about the schools when they were students, or what they happened to read in the news recently. I don't know that, 40% of a school's, or 30% of a research school and 40% of a primary school's rating is based just on some people who answered a survey with a Likert scale to it. So not my favorite, but it is quantifiable. Some people like it. It does give you a basic list of places. I think the interesting things are the research activity for the research schools and the primary care rate. So how many students are going into primary care for the primary care schools. But that's also information you can get from the MSAR. This is just to give you a sense of where we stand right now. So these are our students who are trying to go to med school this coming fall. Our average MCAT and GPA is right about where I'd expect it to be. This also shows you just the range of who was not accepted and who was accepted in terms of their GPAs and MCATs. So if you are falling well outside of the accepted MCAT and GPA ranges, it might be something worth having a conversation with us about. It's also showing you that you can have really high numbers and still have this process not go the way that you had planned for it to go. So definitely thinking beyond just the metrics to this fit and conveying yourself as a candidate beyond your numbers is really important. Next steps, you can certainly start narrowing down your list. At the very least, you can take that spreadsheet and just delete all the schools that are red, that don't let in out-of-state applicants, that are not your home state, so that you'll at least get a list that's 70 versus 140, and then start doing a little bit of kind of basic research from there, talking to people in your network about why they chose where they applied. We have a bunch of school visits and webinars coming up, so coming to those is, I think, more useful than trying to read a website and seeing what schools are saying is important to them. Being able to hear how someone talks about it and how they frame it can be much more useful as you think about how you might frame it in your application. Research prerequisites to make sure that you're good to go in terms of the classes you've taken. And then as you're thinking about what you want to do this summer or this coming year, certainly if there's a school you're really interested in, you know that if you applied to Princeton now, the way that you would talk about yourself in the application, talk about your fit for Princeton in the application is very different having spent time there. The same can be true if you're working at NYU and then want to talk about why you think you're a good fit there. You just have that insider view of it if you're immersed in the environment. So obviously you don't want to put all of your eggs in one basket and only apply to the school you happen to get a job. But if you're still not sure at all what you're doing, and there are certain areas of the country or schools that you might want to affiliate yourself with, you could do kind of a little bit more targeted job search for those schools and the teaching hospitals that are affiliated with them. The second part of this workshop, where I talk more about secondaries and some other school selection, just specifics, will be sometime after spring break. I will probably also do it as a webinar, just because so many of y'all are off campus already. But we could also do an in-person version just because it's a little more personal. I do like seeing you all. It's just so many of our applicants are alums that these webinars seem to be making sense. Bottom line, med school is going to be great no matter where you go, and you'll make the best of it, and you will make it your own. And it's really not about biggest name or fanciest pedigree. It's about going somewhere where you're going to be successful and happy, because you're going to be a better medical student and doctor coming out of a place where you're happy versus a place where you only went because of its name. And as you and your friends start doing this research, there are going to be things that you're looking for that is different from what they're looking for. I know that that's just part of this process, and that's how it's supposed to work. We have a lot of students who just find that perfect fit with that one school that another student is talking to me about, who went on an interview and just said that school absolutely is somewhere, even if I was accepted, I wouldn't go. So you really do want, as much as you can on the front end, to do that research about which schools might be good for you. But at the same time, know that you can't know everything until you go on the interviews. So it's always going to feel like kind of a weird process, because there's so much that happens on the back end, but you have to get yourself to that point to get those interviews to really know more about the schools. So that's all I got. How late did I go? 8:05. Not bad at all. Almost exactly an hour. And I will answer questions if you have them. I'm going to stop the recording.